There's something strangely hypnotic about the way certain movies introduce themselves, not by telling you a story outright, but by throwing you into a feeling. And the first time you watch the trailer for The Running Man, that feeling hits fast, like a broadcast signal you didn't ask for but can't ignore. It's loud, it's exaggerated, it's almost cartoonish on the surface, and yet there's this undercurrent that feels uncomfortably close to reality, especially the longer you sit with it. You start with this artificial, almost glossy vision of the future. Everything feels controlled, curated, like you're watching a world that has been edited for maximum entertainment value. And that's not an accident. The trailer doesn't hide what this movie is. It leans into it. Game shows, crowds screaming, flashing lights, larger-than-life personalities. It looks like fun at first glance. It really does. That's the trick. And then your brain catches up. Because beneath all that spectacle, what you're actually watching is a system where people are being hunted for ratings. Now, that central idea alone, humans turned into contestants in a deadly game show, isn't new anymore. We've seen echoes of it in everything from reality TV culture to modern dystopian films. But back when this movie dropped, that concept felt sharp, maybe even a little dangerous. You can sense that energy in the trailer. It's not just selling action, it's selling a world where entertainment has completely consumed morality. And right in the middle of that chaos, you've got Arnold Schwarzenegger. Now, Arnold at this point in his career wasn't just an action star. He was becoming a kind of symbol. Physically dominant, yes, but also carrying this strange mix of charisma and bluntness that made him perfect for roles like this. The trailer uses him almost like an anchor. Everything else is wild and unpredictable, but he's steady. You look at him, and you immediately understand. This is the guy who's going to push back. But what's interesting is how the trailer frames him at first. He's not introduced as a hero in the traditional sense. There's tension around him, suspicion even. You get the sense that the world inside the film has already judged him before the audience has a chance to. And that creates this subtle curiosity. What did he do? Or maybe more importantly, what did they say he did? That question kind of lingers in the background while the trailer keeps escalating. Then you start seeing the stalkers, and honestly, this is where the tone shifts from just futuristic to something almost surreal. These aren't just hunters, they're performers. Each one feels like they walked out of a different genre entirely. You've got exaggerated costumes, themed weapons, personalities that feel like they belong in a twisted circus. It's theatrical in a way that makes the violence feel even more unsettling because it's being packaged as entertainment inside the movie's world. And at the same time, for us watching the trailer, it's layered like that. You're watching a trailer about a show inside a movie where the audience is cheering for death, and somehow you're also being entertained by it. That kind of self-awareness doesn't scream at you. It just sits there quietly, waiting for you to notice. And then there's the pacing. The trailer doesn't waste time explaining every detail. It moves quickly, almost aggressively, jumping from one intense visual to the next. Explosions, chases, quick flashes of combat. It's edited to feel chaotic, but not random. There's a rhythm to it, like it's mimicking the kind of fast-cut entertainment that the movie itself is criticizing. You start to realize the trailer is doing exactly what the fictional network in the movie would do. Hook you, excite you, keep you watching no matter what's actually happening on screen. That's a pretty bold move when you think about it. And somewhere in the middle of all that noise, you get glimpses of something more grounded. Small moments where Arnold's character isn't just fighting, he's reacting. Confusion, anger, a kind of disbelief at the situation he's been thrown into. Those moments don't last long, but they matter. They give the story weight. Without them, it would just be spectacle. There's also this subtle tension between control and chaos that runs through the entire trailer. On one side, you've got the network, the producers, the hosts, the people orchestrating everything like it's just another episode. Clean, composed, almost smug in their authority. And on the other side, you've got the contestants, especially Arnold's character, who represent unpredictability, the possibility that something might go wrong, that the system might not be as airtight as it thinks. And if you pay attention, the trailer starts to hint at that crack forming. It's not obvious, it's not spelled out, but you can feel it in the way certain shots linger just a second longer than they need to. In the way the crowd's excitement starts to feel a little too intense, almost unstable. In the way Arnold's presence disrupts the rhythm of the game. He doesn't fit. And that's exactly why the trailer keeps pulling you back to him. Because even in a world built entirely around control, unpredictability is the most dangerous thing there is. Another thing that stands out, and this is something you might not notice on a first watch, is how the trailer plays with tone. It never fully commits to being dark or comedic. It hovers somewhere in between. One moment you're watching something that feels genuinely intense, and the next there's this almost satirical edge creeping in. It's like the movie is aware of its own absurdity, but chooses to lean into it instead of pulling back. That balance is tricky. Lean too far into satire, and the stakes disappear. Go too serious, and the concept might feel too heavy-handed. But the trailer suggests a kind of confidence, that it can juggle both without losing its grip. And honestly, that's part of what makes it memorable. Because you're not just watching explosions and one-liners. You're watching a world that feels exaggerated, but not impossible. A system where entertainment has become so dominant that it reshapes reality itself. Where truth can be edited, narratives can be controlled, and the line between hero and villain isn't just blurred, it's rewritten. By the time the trailer starts wrapping up, you're left with this strange mix of excitement and unease. You've seen enough action to know it's going to deliver on that front. You've seen enough of the world to understand the stakes, but there's still this lingering question about how far it's willing to go. Is it just a high-concept action movie with a unique setting, or is it something a little more uncomfortable, something that holds up a mirror, even if it's a distorted one? And maybe that's the real hook. Not the explosions, not the costumes, not even Arnold, as iconic as he is. It's the idea that underneath all the noise, there's a story about control, perception, and the cost of turning human lives into entertainment. And the trailer doesn't give you answers. It just plants that thought in your head and lets it sit there quietly, while everything else is trying to distract you. And once that idea settles in, it becomes almost impossible to shake, because the more you replay those images in your head, the more they start connecting in ways the trailer never outright explains. So when the story actually begins inside the running man, it doesn't ease you in gently. It drops you into a version of America that feels like it's been stretched to its breaking point, economically strained, politically rigid, and socially engineered to keep people distracted just enough that they don't push back. There's this constant sense that everything is being watched, filtered, and repackaged before it ever reaches the public. And that's where we first meet Ben Richards, played by Arnold Schwarzenegger, but not in the way you'd expect from a typical action lead. He's not storming into the frame with confidence. There's tension around him right away. He's a helicopter pilot, part of a military system that's clearly enforcing control, but something is off. You can feel it in the way the scene is framed. There's hesitation. There's resistance. He's given an order. And it's the kind of order that tells you everything you need to know about this world without a single speech spelling it out. Civilian unrest, unarmed people, and a command that crosses a line most people would instinctively recognize. And Richards doesn't follow through. That moment, quiet, almost understated compared to everything that comes later, is where the entire story roots itself. Because in a world like this, refusal isn't just disobedience, it's a threat. And the film wastes no time showing you what happens to threats. The narrative jumps forward, and suddenly Richards isn't a soldier anymore. He's a convicted criminal, or at least that's what the public believes. The system has already rewritten the story. Footage has been edited, context removed, and now he's the villain in a version of events that never actually happened. It's subtle, but incredibly important. The movie isn't just about physical survival, it's about narrative control. Whoever controls the story controls reality. That idea starts to expand as we see the prison environment he's been thrown into. It's not just a place of confinement, it's dehumanizing by design. The inmates are treated less like people and more like inventory, something to be managed, contained, and eventually used. There's this cold efficiency to everything, like the system isn't even pretending to rehabilitate anyone. It's just processing them. And even here, Richards stands out, not because he's louder or more aggressive, but because there's a kind of quiet defiance in him. He doesn't fully bend to the environment, even when it would be easier to just blend in and survive. That resistance is what makes the next part feel inevitable, rather than coincidental. The escape. Now, the way the film handles this sequence is interesting because it doesn't frame it as some grand, heroic breakout with perfectly timed moves and dramatic speeches. It's messy, it's tense, it feels like something that could actually go wrong at any second. And that grounded approach makes it more engaging because you're not watching a flawless plan. You're watching people react, adapt, and take risks without knowing if they'll pay off. Richards doesn't escape alone either. There's a small group dynamic that starts forming, and it adds another layer to the story. These aren't just background characters. They represent different ways people cope with a system like this. Some are desperate, some are opportunistic, some are just trying to survive long enough to see another day. And putting Richards among them highlights what makes him different without needing to over-explain it. For a brief moment after they break out, there's this sense of possibility. The outside world feels open, unpredictable, almost hopeful compared to the controlled environment they just left. But that feeling doesn't last long, because the reach of the system extends far beyond prison walls. You start to see how deeply embedded this control really is. Media, law enforcement, public perception, it's all interconnected. Richards isn't just a fugitive, he's a symbol now, whether he wants to be or not. And symbols are dangerous, especially when they contradict the official narrative. That's when the story introduces one of its most important elements, not through action, but through media, the network, and more specifically, the show. The Running Man isn't just entertainment inside this world, it's a cultural phenomenon. It's the thing people gather around, the thing they talk about, the thing that shapes how they see right and wrong. And the way it's presented is almost disturbingly familiar. Bright lights, charismatic hosts, audience participation, it's everything you'd expect from a hit television program, except the stakes are real lives. The film takes its time letting you absorb that. You see clips, reactions, the way people engage with it. It's not portrayed as something fringe or controversial. It's normalized, accepted, celebrated even. And that's where the tension really starts to build. Because, as a viewer, that Richards is eventually going to be pulled into that world. The trailer already hinted at it, but the story makes you feel the inevitability of it. It's not just a plot device. It's the logical endpoint of everything the system has been building toward. Before that happens, though, There's a brief but important stretch where Richards interacts with civilians, ordinary people who live under this system every day. And those moments are surprisingly layered. Some people believe the official story about him without question. Others are skeptical, maybe even quietly sympathetic. It's not black and white. And that complexity makes the world feel more real. You start to understand that control doesn't just come from force, it comes from belief, from repetition, from the constant reinforcement of a single narrative until it becomes the only one people recognize. And then, almost like a switch being flipped, the story tightens its grip again. Richards is captured. Not in some overly dramatic last stand kind of way, but in a manner that reinforces the idea that escape was never really sustainable. The system is too vast, too interconnected. You can run, you can hide, but eventually it catches up. And when it does, it doesn't just punish you, it repurposes you. This is where the transition into the game show becomes more than just a setting change. It becomes the core of the story. Richards isn't just a prisoner anymore, he's content, a character in a narrative that's about to be broadcast to millions. And the people controlling that narrative aren't interested in truth, they're interested in ratings. That shift is chilling in a way that sneaks up on you. Because by this point, you've spent enough time with Richards to understand who he is, what he stands for. And now you're watching him being reshaped into something else entirely, not through physical force, but through editing, framing, and presentation. The same tools that turned him into a criminal in the first place. And just as that realization starts to settle in, the world of the show begins to open up, larger, louder, more theatrical than anything we've seen so far, but built on the same foundation of control, which is exactly where everything is about to escalate in a way that changes the tone completely. And the moment that world fully reveals itself, it doesn't feel like a separate reality. It feels like the logical evolution of everything we've already been watching, just turned all the way up. The lights are brighter, the colors more aggressive, the energy almost overwhelming, but underneath it, nothing has really changed. It's still about control. It's still about perception. It's just louder now. The introduction to the show itself is handled with this almost unsettling confidence. You're not eased into it. You're thrown into a live broadcast environment where everything is polished, rehearsed, and carefully constructed to feel spontaneous. The audience is electric, completely invested, reacting on cue but also genuinely excited. And that's what makes it uncomfortable. It doesn't feel forced. It feels like people actually want this. At the center of it all is Killian, played by Richard Dawson, and his presence shifts the tone in a way that's hard to ignore. He doesn't come across as a typical villain. There's no overt menace in the way he speaks or carries himself. In fact, he's charming, effortlessly so. He smiles, he jokes, he engages with the audience like a seasoned entertainer who knows exactly how to keep people hooked, and that's precisely what makes him dangerous. Because Killian doesn't need to raise his voice or issue threats. His power comes from influence, from the ability to shape how millions of people interpret what they're seeing. He's not just hosting a show, he's controlling a narrative in real time, deciding who gets to be seen as a hero, who gets framed as a monster, and how the audience should feel about it. When Richards is brought onto the stage, there's this immediate clash. Not physical, not yet, but ideological. You can feel it in the way they look at each other. Killian sees opportunity, ratings, a story that can be molded into something compelling. Richards, on the other hand, is still trying to hold on to reality, to resist being turned into a character. But resistance, in this environment, is just another form of entertainment. The interview segment is where that tension really starts to crystallize. Killian doesn't attack Richards directly. Instead, he guides the conversation, steering it in subtle ways, framing questions that box Richards into a version of himself the audience can easily digest. It's manipulative, but it's done so smoothly that if you weren't paying attention, you might miss it. And then there's the crowd. They're not passive observers, they're participants. Their reactions matter, their approval, their excitement. It feeds the entire system. And the film takes its time showing how easily that energy can be directed. A few carefully chosen words, a bit of edited footage, and suddenly public opinion shifts. Not completely, not instantly, but enough to create momentum. Richards tries to push back, tries to break through that constructed image, but the environment isn't built for truth. It's built for engagement. And engagement thrives on simplicity. Clear heroes, clear villains, no room for nuance. Which brings us to the stalkers. Up until this point, they felt almost like exaggerated figures in the background, teased in glimpses, hinted at through promotional material inside the film's world. But once the game begins, they step into focus in a way that's both theatrical and oddly methodical. Each one isn't just a hunter, they're a brand. You've got personalities crafted around specific themes, weapons that match their identities, entrances that feel like something out of a wrestling event or a live performance. It's all designed to make them memorable, marketable, and most importantly, entertaining. The violence they bring isn't random. It's choreographed in a way that maximizes audience reaction. And that's where the film does something interesting. It doesn't present these characters as purely menacing. There's an element of absurdity to them, a kind of exaggerated flair that almost makes you want to laugh. Until you remember what they're actually doing. Because at the end of the day, they're hunting people. The arena itself plays a huge role in shaping that experience. It's not just a static location, it's a controlled environment, segmented into different zones, each designed to create specific types of encounters. Urban decay, industrial spaces, artificial landscapes. It's like a playground built for conflict, where every corner has been engineered to produce tension. And as Richards is pushed into this environment, there's a shift in how he operates. He's no longer reacting blindly. There's a kind of focus that starts to emerge, a strategic awareness that wasn't as visible before. He begins to understand the rules, not just the physical ones, but the psychological ones. He realizes that survival isn't just about strength or speed, it's about unpredictability, about refusing to play the role that's been assigned to him. That realization changes the dynamic completely. Because the show depends on predictability. It depends on contestants behaving in ways the audience expects. Fear, panic, desperation, those are the emotions that drive engagement. But Richard starts to disrupt that pattern. He doesn't respond the way the system anticipates, and that creates a kind of tension that the producers can't fully control. You can feel that shift ripple back into the control room. Suddenly, the people behind the scenes, who up until now have seemed calm, composed, almost detached, start to react. Adjustments are made. Narratives are tweaked. The footage being broadcast is carefully selected to maintain a certain perception, even as reality begins to drift away from that script. And this is where the film really leans into its core idea. Because what's happening in the arena isn't just a fight for survival, it's a battle over truth. Richards isn't just trying to stay alive, he's trying to expose the cracks in a system that relies on illusion. Every unexpected move, every moment that doesn't align with the narrative becomes a threat. And the more he resists, the more the system pushes back. The stalkers become more aggressive, more focused. The environment feels tighter, less forgiving. There's a sense that the game is no longer just about entertainment. It's about regaining control, about proving that no matter what Richards does, the system can still dictate the outcome. But here's the thing. Once unpredictability enters a controlled system, it doesn't just disappear. It spreads. And you start to see hints of that, not just in the arena, but in the way certain people behind the scenes begin to question what they're doing. Small moments, brief glances, subtle hesitations, nothing overt, nothing that would disrupt the flow immediately, but enough to suggest that the narrative isn't as stable as it once was. Meanwhile, the audience, both inside the film and watching it, starts to experience something unfamiliar. Doubt. Not enough to completely overturn their beliefs, but enough to create a crack, a moment where they question whether what they're seeing is the full story. And in a system built entirely on controlling perception, even a small crack can be dangerous. As the game continues, that tension keeps building, layering on top of itself in a way that feels both inevitable and unpredictable at the same time. You know something is going to give, you just don't know exactly when or how, and that uncertainty is what keeps pulling you deeper into it, because for the first time, it feels like the outcome isn't entirely in the system's hands anymore.
And once that uncertainty takes hold, the entire rhythm of the game begins to feel different. Not slower, not quieter, but less controlled in a way that's almost invisible unless you're really paying attention. The spectacle is still there. The explosions, the exaggerated entrances, the carefully curated chaos. But underneath it, something is slipping. You start noticing it in the way the production team reacts. There's a fraction of a second longer before decisions are made. A slight edge in their voices. The kind of tension that doesn't belong in a system that's supposed to run like a machine. Because machines don't hesitate. Machines don't doubt. People do. And the more Richards continues to defy expectations, the more that human element starts to show through the cracks. Not in some dramatic, rebellious outburst, but in small, almost reluctant ways. A technician who lingers a little too long on a feed.
A producer who questions a cut before approving it. These are tiny shifts, but they matter because they signal that control isn't absolute anymore. Inside the arena, that shift becomes even more pronounced. The encounters with the stalkers start to feel less like performances and more like confrontations that could genuinely go either way. The theatrical edge is still there. These characters don't suddenly become grounded or realistic, but the predictability starts to fade. Richards adapts, learns, and most importantly, refuses to engage on their terms. He doesn't just fight them, he dismantles the idea behind them. That's what makes those sequences interesting beyond the action itself. Each stalker represents a different kind of fear, packaged in a way that's meant to entertain. When Richards takes them on, he's not just surviving, he's exposing how artificial that fear really is. And the audience, both inside the film and watching from the outside, starts to pick up on that, even if they can't fully articulate it. There's a moment where you can almost feel the shift in perspective, where the stalkers stop being the main attraction and start becoming obstacles, tools of a system that's losing its grip. And back in the studio, that loss of grip becomes harder to ignore. Damon Killian, still composed on the surface, starts to adjust his approach. The charm doesn't disappear, but there's a sharper edge to it now. His commentary becomes more deliberate, more calculated, as if he's trying to steer the audience back toward a narrative that's beginning to drift. Because for someone like him, losing control of the story isn't just a professional setback, it's a fundamental threat to his authority. So the system pushes harder. The edits become more aggressive. Footage is manipulated in ways that are a little less seamless than before. There's a sense of urgency creeping in, like they're trying to keep up with something that's moving faster than they anticipated, and that urgency creates mistakes. Small ones at first, but noticeable. And once the audience starts noticing, even subconsciously, it becomes harder to maintain the illusion. Meanwhile, Richards begins to connect more dots, not just about the game itself, but about the larger structure surrounding it. He starts to understand that what he's dealing with isn't just a show, it's a mechanism, a way to reinforce control, to shape public perception, to turn fear into entertainment and dissent into something that can be neatly packaged and consumed. That awareness changes how he moves through the world. He's no longer just reacting to immediate threats. He's thinking ahead, looking for ways to disrupt not just the physical environment, but the narrative itself. And that's a much more dangerous approach because it targets the foundation of the system rather than its surface. There's also a growing sense of connection between Richards and the few people who begin to see through the illusion. It's not overtly sentimental or overly emphasized, but it's there. A recognition that truth, even when it's suppressed, has a way of finding its way through cracks in the system. And those cracks are getting wider. You can see it in the way the audience reacts during certain moments. There's still excitement, still that almost addictive engagement with the spectacle, but it's mixed with something else now. Hesitation, confusion, the kind of reaction that suggests they're not entirely sure how they're supposed to feel anymore. And that's a problem for a system that relies on clear, predictable emotional responses. As the game pushes toward its later stages, the tension stops being about whether Richards can survive individual encounters and starts becoming about whether the system itself can maintain its structure under pressure. The stakes shift from personal survival to something broader, something that affects everyone watching, whether they realize it or not. Because if the narrative breaks completely, if the audience sees the truth in a way that can't be easily edited or reframed, then the entire foundation of control starts to collapse. And that possibility hangs over everything, not as a guarantee, not as a clear outcome, but as a growing presence that becomes harder to ignore with each passing moment. And the closer that possibility gets, the more the system begins to reveal its true nature. Not the polished version it broadcasts, but the desperate machinery underneath, the part that doesn't care how things look anymore, as long as it can maintain control. Because at a certain point, presentation stops being enough. Force takes over. You can feel that escalation not just in what's happening to Richards, but in how aggressively the game itself starts to shift. The boundaries that once felt structured, even if artificially so, begin to blur. The rules aren't exactly broken, but they're bent in ways that make it clear fairness was never part of the design to begin with. And that realization lands differently now. Earlier, the audience inside this world could enjoy the illusion because it felt contained. Dangerous, sure, but controlled. Now that illusion starts to fracture, and what's left underneath is something far less comfortable. Because if the system can change the rules mid-game, if it can reshape reality on the fly, then nothing they've been watching can really be trusted. Not the outcomes, not the narratives, not even the idea of who deserves to win or lose. Richards leans into that instability in a way that feels almost instinctive at this point. He's no longer just surviving within the system, he's actively destabilizing it. Every decision he makes seems to carry a double purpose now. On the surface, it's about staying alive. But underneath, it's about exposing the seams, forcing the system to react in ways it would rather keep hidden. And the more it reacts, the more it reveals. There's a particular kind of tension that builds when a system designed to appear flawless starts showing its imperfections in real time. It's not explosive at first, it's subtle. A misstep here, a contradiction there, a moment where what's being shown doesn't quite align with what's happening, but those moments accumulate, and eventually they become impossible to ignore. Back in the control room, that pressure is reaching a point where composure alone isn't enough to hold things together. Decisions are made faster, sometimes without the careful consideration that defined earlier moments. There's less patience, less confidence, and with that comes a kind of volatility that wasn't there before. It's not chaos, not yet, but it's getting close. Killian, still maintaining that outward charm, starts to reveal something sharper underneath. Not through overt anger or panic, but through a tightening of control. His words carry more weight now, more intention. He's not just guiding the narrative, he's trying to reclaim it. But the problem with reclaiming something that's already slipping is that every attempt to tighten your grip can make it slip further. And you see that in the way the audience begins to respond. They're still engaged, still watching, but their reactions aren't as unified as they were before. There are moments where the expected cheer doesn't come as quickly. Moments where the energy dips just slightly, as if people are processing something they don't fully understand. That hesitation matters. Because once an audience starts thinking instead of reacting, the entire structure of a spectacle like this begins to change. Inside the arena, the environment itself seems to reflect that shift. It doesn't physically transform, but the way it's used feels different. The spaces that once felt like controlled stages now feel unpredictable, less like sets, more like environments that can't be fully managed. And Richards moves through them with a kind of clarity that wasn't there at the beginning. He understands now that the real battleground isn't just physical, it's informational. It's about what's seen, what's hidden, what's believed, and that understanding allows him to take risks that wouldn't have made sense earlier. Not reckless risks, but calculated ones. Moves designed not just to survive an encounter, but to send a message. And those messages start to land, not all at once, not in some grand, obvious reveal, but in fragments, in moments where the truth slips through before it can be edited out, in reactions that don't match the narrative being pushed, in the growing disconnect between what the audience is told and what they're starting to suspect. That disconnect is where everything begins to unravel, because a system like this doesn't collapse from a single blow, it erodes, piece by piece, moment by moment, until eventually, the gap between illusion and reality becomes too wide to bridge. And once that gap exists, even briefly, it creates a kind of momentum that's incredibly hard to stop. You can feel it building as the story pushes toward its final stretch. Not as a traditional climax where everything converges neatly, but as a mounting pressure that's been building since the very beginning. Every decision, every act of defiance, every small crack in the system has led to this point. A point where the outcome isn't just about whether Richards makes it out alive, it's about whether the truth can survive long enough to be seen. Because if it can, if even for a moment the audience is forced to confront what's really happening, then the system loses something far more valuable than control over a single contestant. It loses credibility. And once credibility is gone, everything built on top of it starts to feel unstable. That's the tension that carries these final moments. Not just physical danger, though that's still very much present, but the weight of what's at stake beyond the immediate action. The sense that what's happening inside this arena could ripple outward, affecting people who aren't even aware of it yet. And Richards, whether he set out to or not, has become the center of that ripple. Not because he's perfect, not because he's invincible, but because he refused to play along in a system that depends on compliance. And sometimes that refusal is enough to change everything. And that possibility, that one person's refusal can actually ripple outward and disrupt something this massive, lingers in your mind long after the immediate tension starts to settle, because once the story reaches that breaking point, it doesn't explode in a clean, cinematic way. It fractures. Not all at once, not with a single decisive moment that neatly wraps everything up, but in a series of realizations that hit different characters and the audience at slightly different times. That's what makes the final stretch feel more unsettling than triumphant. It's not just about winning or losing anymore. It's about exposure. Because once the illusion cracks wide enough, you can't unsee what's underneath. And the film leans into that idea by letting the consequences unfold in a way that feels earned rather than forced. Richard's actions throughout the game haven't just been about survival, they've been about creating moments that the system can't fully contain. And now those moments start connecting. Evidence begins to matter. Truth, even in fragments, begins to carry weight. And suddenly, the same tools that were used to manipulate the narrative, cameras, broadcasts, media control, start becoming liabilities instead of assets. Because when you rely on visibility to maintain control, you also risk revealing more than you intended. That reversal is subtle at first, but it gains momentum quickly. Back in the broadcast space, the confidence that once defined everything starts to feel hollow, not gone entirely, but strained. There's a sense that the people in control are now reacting instead of dictating, adjusting instead of planning. And that shift changes the entire tone. Killian, still trying to maintain that composed, almost effortless presence, begins to feel the pressure in a way that can't be completely masked. It's not a breakdown, it's more controlled than that. But there's an edge now, a tightening that suggests he understands exactly what's at stake. Because for him, this isn't just about a single show going off the rails. It's about the possibility that the system he represents, this entire structure of controlled entertainment and manipulated perception, might be seen for what it actually is. And once that happens, there's no easy way to put it back together. The audience inside this world becomes a crucial part of that shift. Their reactions, which once felt predictable and easily guided, start to fragment. Some still cling to the narrative they've been given, reacting the way they're expected to. But others hesitate, question, react in ways that don't align perfectly with the broadcast. That division is subtle, but it's powerful, because a unified audience is easy to control. A divided one isn't. And that's where the film finds its most interesting tension, not in the physical confrontations, though those are still very much present, but in the psychological space between what people are told and what they begin to believe on their own. Richards, by this point, isn't just a participant in the game anymore. He's become a kind of focal point for that tension, not intentionally, not in some calculated, heroic way, but simply by refusing to conform to the role he was assigned. And that refusal has consequences that extend far beyond him. The system pushes back, of course. It has to. It can't simply allow itself to be dismantled without resistance. So the attempts to regain control become more direct, more forceful, less concerned with maintaining the illusion of fairness or entertainment. But here's the thing. Once the illusion is already cracking, those attempts don't land the same way. They feel desperate. And desperation is something audiences, both inside the film and outside of it, can recognize almost instinctively. There's a point where the balance shifts completely, not in a loud, obvious way, but in a quiet realization that the system no longer feels invincible, that it can be challenged, that it can make mistakes. And once that realization takes hold, it changes everything about how the remaining moments are experienced. The tension doesn't disappear, it transforms. It's no longer just about whether Richards can survive the next encounter. It's about what his survival or even his resistance represents in a broader sense. About what happens when people start to see through the narratives they've been fed for so long. And that's where the film's final movements become less about action and more about consequence. Because exposing the truth isn't the same as fixing the system. It doesn't magically resolve everything. What it does is create awareness. And awareness is unpredictable. It can lead to change. It can lead to chaos. It can lead to resistance or confusion or even denial. The film doesn't try to neatly define what comes next, and that restraint is part of what makes it linger. By the time everything settles, there's no sense of a perfectly restored order, no clean reset. What's left is something messier, more uncertain, but also more honest. The system has been shaken, the narrative has been challenged, and the audience, both within the story and watching from the outside, has been forced to confront the idea that what they were seeing wasn't the full truth, and maybe never was. That's where the story finds its final note. Not in a definitive answer, but in a question that hangs in the air long after the credits would roll. If a system built on illusion can be exposed, even briefly, what happens next? Does it rebuild itself stronger, learning from its mistakes? Or does that moment of exposure create cracks that can never fully be sealed? The film doesn't rush to answer that. It just leaves you there, sitting with the implications, replaying everything you've seen, and realizing that the spectacle was never really the point. It was the distraction. And once you see past it, you can't quite go back to watching the same way again. What's fascinating is that once you step outside the story itself and start looking at when the running man actually arrived, the whole thing takes on a completely different layer of meaning. Because this wasn't just some random action movie dropped into theaters without context. It came out at a very specific time, and that timing matters more than people usually give it credit for. We're talking late 1980s America, right in the middle of a decade that was obsessed with excess, media expansion, and this growing relationship between entertainment and identity. Cable television was booming. Game shows weren't just popular, they were everywhere. The idea of watching ordinary people put themselves on display for an audience, that was already becoming normalized, even if it hadn't reached the level we see today. So when a film like this shows up, presenting a world where that same concept is pushed to its most extreme conclusion, it doesn't feel like pure science fiction. It feels like a distorted reflection of something already happening, and that's part of what makes its release so interesting. Because on the surface, studios were still very much in that blockbuster mindset: big stars, big action, clear marketing hooks, and having Arnold Schwarzenegger front and center guaranteed attention. By that point, he had already established himself as a major box office draw. Audiences knew what they were getting when they saw his name attached to a project. Physical presence, memorable one-liners, and a kind of larger-than-life energy that defined action cinema of that era. But this film sits in a slightly different space compared to some of his other work around that time. It's still an action movie, no question about that. The marketing leaned into that aspect heavily. Explosions, combat, spectacle, that's what sold tickets. But underneath that, there's a satirical edge that doesn't always get highlighted in the initial conversation around it. And that's where the industry context becomes really important. Because the late 80s weren't exactly known for subtle, layered social commentary in mainstream action films. You had glimpses of it here and there, but more often than not, those movies were about straightforward narratives, clear heroes, clear villains, and a focus on entertainment above all else. So, when this film blends that familiar structure with something more critical, something that questions media manipulation, public perception, and the commercialization of violence, it creates this interesting tension between what the movie is selling and what it's actually saying. That tension probably played a role in how it was received at the time. Audiences came in expecting one thing and got something slightly more complex. Not overwhelmingly so, it's not trying to be an art house film, but enough to stand out. Enough to make people think, even if that wasn't the primary reason they bought a ticket. Critically, the response was mixed in a way that feels pretty typical for films that sit between genres like this. Some leaned into the action and enjoyed it for what it was. Others picked up on the satirical elements and appreciated the commentary, and then there were those who felt it didn't fully commit to either side. But here's the interesting part. Over time, the conversation around the film has shifted, because as real-world media evolved, especially with the rise of reality television, 24-hour news cycles, and eventually social media, the ideas presented in the film started to feel less exaggerated and more familiar. That concept of turning real people into content, shaping narratives for mass consumption, prioritizing engagement over truth, it's no longer speculative. It's part of everyday life. And that's where the film's legacy really starts to take shape. What might have once felt like an over-the-top premise now reads as oddly prescient. Not in every detail, of course. The film still has its stylized, exaggerated elements, but in its core idea, the notion that entertainment and control can become intertwined in ways that aren't immediately obvious. From an industry perspective, it also represents a moment where studios were willing to experiment within the framework of mainstream cinema, to take a high-concept idea and package it in a way that was accessible without completely stripping it of its edge. That balance isn't easy to achieve. Too much commentary, and you risk alienating audiences looking for entertainment. Too much focus on spectacle, and the underlying ideas get lost. This film walks that line in a way that's imperfect, but interesting. And looking back, you can see how it fits into the broader trajectory of Hollywood at the time. It's part of that wave of action films that defined the decade, but it also hints at something that would become more prominent later: the blending of genres, the incorporation of social commentary into mainstream entertainment, the idea that a movie can entertain and provoke thought at the same time. Even the casting choices reflect that duality. Arnold brings the physical presence and star power, anchoring the film in something familiar for audiences. But the supporting cast, particularly in the roles tied to the media world, adds a different kind of energy, one that leans more into performance, into personality, into that exaggerated version of television culture. And that combination creates a dynamic that feels unique to this film. It's not just an action movie. It's not just a satire. It's something in between. And that in-between space is what gives it staying power. Because movies that fit neatly into a single category can sometimes fade as trends change. But films that exist in that slightly uncomfortable middle ground, where they're doing more than one thing at once, tend to invite revisiting, reevaluation, new interpretations as the world around them changes. And in the case of this film, the world has changed in ways that make its themes feel more relevant now than they might have at the time of its release, which is a strange kind of success when you think about it. Not just being remembered, but being understood differently as time goes on. That's not something every movie gets.
What starts to become clear as everything narrows toward its end is that The Running Man was never really interested in giving you a clean separation between game and reality. It keeps folding those two ideas into each other until even the audience, both inside the story and outside of it, has to constantly recalibrate what they think they're watching. And that's where the final stretch of the narrative gets its weight, because by this point, Arnold Schwarzenegger as Ben Richards is no longer just reacting to threats inside the arena. He's operating with an awareness that the arena itself is only one layer of a much larger machine. Every movement he makes carries the awareness that it will be interpreted, edited, and broadcast in ways he can't fully control, but can still influence. That shift changes the tone of everything he does. Earlier, survival was immediate, physical, direct.
Now it becomes something more strategic, almost psychological. Every encounter isn't just about getting through it, it's about what that moment will look like when it's broadcast back to millions of viewers who may or may not be seeing the truth. And that's where the system starts to show real strain. Because controlling a narrative is only effective as long as the narrative stays internally consistent. The moment contradictions begin to surface in ways that can't be easily edited out or reframed, the illusion starts to lose coherence. You see it in the broadcast environment first. The pacing changes. The commentary becomes more reactive. There are small moments where Killian, played by Richard Dawson, has to adjust on the fly instead of guiding the flow with confidence. He's still in control on paper, but the emotional certainty that once defined his presence starts to erode. And that erosion is dangerous because his entire role depends on the audience believing that the show is not just entertaining, but authoritative, that what they are seeing is the most complete version of reality available to them. Once that belief weakens, even slightly, everything built on top of it becomes unstable. Inside the arena, Richards continues to push against the boundaries of what the system expects him to do, not through constant aggression, but through unpredictability. He stops behaving like a contestant designed for consumption and starts behaving like someone who understands the structure he's inside of. That awareness is what makes him harder to control, because the system isn't built for participants who understand the system, it's built for participants who react within it. And as that gap widens, the show begins to lose its clean edges. The stalkers, including figures like Jesse Ventura as Captain Freedom, are still present, still dangerous, still theatrical, but their function starts to shift. They're no longer just entertainment-driven antagonists. They become increasingly desperate instruments of a system trying to reassert dominance. But force alone doesn't restore perception. It only escalates tension. And tension, once visible to an audience, becomes something that can be interpreted in multiple ways, not just as entertainment, but as instability. That's where the most important transformation happens. The audience inside the film stops being a unified emotional body. Instead, you start to see fragmentation. Some still respond exactly as expected, cheering, reacting, engaging with the spectacle. But others begin to hesitate, to question, to notice inconsistencies between what they're seeing and what they've been told to believe. And once that split appears, it can't be fully reversed, because belief, once interrupted, doesn't return to its original form. It adapts. Richards becomes the focal point of that adaptation without ever consciously positioning himself that way. He isn't trying to become a symbol, but the system keeps forcing him into that role by over-defining him, over-broadcasting him, and over-reacting to his actions in ways that expose its own biases. And the more they try to define him, the less controllable he becomes. That contradiction sits at the heart of the final act. Control requires predictability. But the more the system attempts to enforce predictability on someone who has already broken out of that framework, the more unpredictable the entire structure becomes. It's a feedback loop that starts to accelerate, not explosively, but inevitably. And by the time the final movements of the story begin to fully take shape, what you're really watching is not just a confrontation between a man and a system, but a confrontation between two competing realities, one that is carefully constructed, and one that refuses to stay contained. And that shift in how the film is understood over time becomes even more interesting when you start looking closely at the people inside it. The faces, the performances, the way each character contributes to that uneasy balance between spectacle and commentary, because the running man doesn't rely on just one kind of presence to carry it. It builds its world through contrast. At the center, of course, you've got Arnold Schwarzenegger as Ben Richards, and what stands out here isn't just his physicality, which at this point was already iconic, but the way he plays restraint. This isn't the unstoppable, emotionally distant figure you see in something like The Terminator. There's more friction in this performance, more resistance. He reacts, he questions, he absorbs what's happening around him before acting on it. And that subtle shift matters because it grounds the entire film. In a world that's exaggerated, theatrical, almost surreal at times, Richards feels anchored in something more human. Not overly emotional, not overly expressive, but present in a way that keeps the story from drifting too far into pure spectacle. Opposite him, you've got Richard Dawson as Damon Killian, and honestly, this casting choice is one of the smartest decisions the film makes. Dawson wasn't just an actor, he was a real television personality, someone audiences already associated with charm, quick wit, and that effortless ability to engage a crowd. So when he steps into this role, he doesn't feel like a villain in the traditional sense. He feels authentic. That's what makes him unsettling. He doesn't need to transform into something dark or menacing. He just leans slightly into what he already represents: charisma, control, likability, and lets that do the work. The performance never feels forced. It feels natural, which in this context is far more effective than anything overtly sinister. And the dynamic between him and Arnold is what really drives the film's core tension. Because they're not just opposing forces physically, they represent two completely different kinds of power. Richards is physical presence, direct action, resistance. Killian is influence, perception, narrative control. And neither one fully cancels the other out, which keeps their interactions engaging even when they're not in the same physical space. Then you start looking at the supporting characters, and this is where the film quietly builds texture. Maria Conchita Alonso plays Amber Mendez, and her role is more important than it might initially seem. She starts off as someone embedded within the system, someone who believes, or at least accepts, the version of reality being presented. But as the story unfolds, her perspective shifts, and that shift isn't rushed. It's gradual, shaped by what she sees, what she experiences, and how those experiences contradict the narrative she's been given. That progression adds another layer to the film's exploration of perception because it shows how belief can change, not through force, but through exposure to something real. Her dynamic with Richards isn't overly sentimental or forced into a traditional romantic arc. It's more about alignment, two people coming to understand the same truth from different starting points. Then there's Yaphet Kotto as William Laughlin, who brings a completely different energy into the mix. His presence connects the story to something larger than the immediate game. There's a sense of history, of resistance that existed before Richards entered the picture, and that matters, because it reinforces the idea that this system didn't appear overnight, and it won't disappear overnight either. There are layers to it. People who have been pushing back in their own ways long before the main events of the film. Kotto's performance carries that weight without needing to overstate it. It's in the way he speaks, the way he observes, the way he interacts with Richards, not as a follower, but as someone who understands the bigger picture. And then, of course, you've got the stalkers. This is where the film leans fully into its theatrical side. But even here, there's a kind of intentionality behind how these characters are presented. They're exaggerated, yes, almost caricatures, but each one is designed to represent a different kind of spectacle. Jesse Ventura as Captain Freedom, for example, feels like a direct commentary on celebrity culture within this world. He's not just a fighter. He's a brand, a personality that exists both inside and outside the game. There's ego there, performance layered on top of performance, and it creates this interesting overlap between the fictional show and the real-world idea of entertainment figures. Then you've got characters like Dynamo and Buzzsaw, who push that theatricality even further. Their designs, their behavior, the way they engage with the arena, it's all heightened, almost absurd at times, but never random. Each one contributes to the idea that this isn't just a game. It's a production, and they're part of the cast. What's interesting is how the film doesn't ask you to take them completely seriously in a traditional sense. There's an awareness of how over the top they are, and that awareness becomes part of the experience. You're meant to see the performance, to recognize the exaggeration, and at the same time, understand the danger behind it. Because even if they feel like characters, the consequences of what they do are real. That duality between performance and reality runs through every major character in the film. Richards resists it, Killian controls it, Amber questions it, Laughlin contextualizes it, and the stalkers embody it. That's what makes the cast work as a whole. It's not just about individual performances, it's about how those performances interact with the film's central ideas. How each character represents a different relationship to the system, a different way of existing within or pushing against it. And when you step back and look at it like that, you start to see that the film's strength isn't just in its concept or its action sequences, it's in the way it uses its characters to explore that concept from multiple angles without needing to spell everything out directly. It trusts the audience to pick up on those layers, and that trust is part of what keeps it engaging even decades later. What's interesting is that when you strip away the layers of performance, spectacle, and the controlled chaos of the game itself, The Running Man starts to feel like it's built around a very simple, almost uncomfortable idea. What happens when truth stops being the thing people are actually watching, not debating it, not analyzing it, just watching something else entirely and believing that's reality? That's the space the film lives in. And by this point in the story, especially after seeing how Arnold Schwarzenegger as Ben Richards has been pushed through the system, reshaped by it, and forced to operate inside it, you start realizing the plot isn't really structured like a traditional action narrative. It's not just escalation after escalation leading to a final showdown. It's more like a slow reveal of how deeply embedded manipulation has already become. Even the idea of a plot overview starts to feel a little misleading because the film doesn't move in a straight line. It moves in reactions. Richards does something, the system responds. The system reshapes the story. The audience reacts, and then the cycle continues, each time slightly more unstable than before. At the surface level, though, what you see is a man forced into a televised death game after being framed by a media-controlled government system, with every step of his journey broadcast, edited, and reframed as entertainment. That's the spine of it. But the way it unfolds matters more than the outline, because the film consistently blurs the line between what's happening and how it's being presented. There are moments where you're watching Richards navigate the arena, and it feels like straightforward survival. Physical challenges, tactical decisions, encounters with the stalkers. And then there are moments where the broadcast itself becomes the dominant layer, where commentary, audience reaction, and editing choices start shaping the meaning of what you're seeing. And that's where the film quietly shifts into something more reflective. Not in a heavy-handed way, not in a way that pulls you out of the experience, but in a way that makes you start questioning how much of what you've already accepted is being filtered. Amber Mendez, played by Maria Conchita Alonso, becomes a key part of that shift. Her perspective acts almost like a bridge between the official narrative and the reality unfolding underneath it. She doesn't just observe Richards, she observes how he is being represented, and those two things begin to diverge more and more clearly as the story progresses. That divergence is where the tension lives, because once representation and reality stop matching, everything becomes negotiable. Truth stops being fixed. It becomes something that can be adjusted depending on who is telling the story. And the film never lets you forget that the people controlling the narrative, the production system behind the game, aren't neutral observers. They're active participants. Every camera angle, every cut, every delay in information is a decision. Even the audience inside the world is shaped by those decisions. Their understanding of Richards, of the stalkers, of the game itself, it's all mediated. Filtered through a system designed not just to show events, but to interpret them for maximum emotional response. That's why the stakes feel different than a standard action film. It's not just survival in a physical sense. It's survival of perception. Richards isn't only trying to stay alive, he's trying to exist outside the version of himself being broadcast. And that becomes increasingly difficult as the game continues, because the system doesn't just want him dead or alive, it wants him defined, controlled, predictable, which is exactly what he refuses to become. That refusal is what drives the entire structure forward, even when the narrative tries to confine him into a role. Every time the system attempts to frame him as something simple, criminal, monster, pawn, he disrupts that framing through action that doesn't fit the expected pattern, and that disruption accumulates. Meanwhile, Killian, played by Richard Dawson, continues to operate as the architect of that framing. What makes his role so compelling in this stage of the story is that he isn't just reacting to Richards, he's actively trying to preserve the integrity of the system itself. Because if Richards represents unpredictability, then Killian represents the necessity of control. And those two ideas can't coexist indefinitely in a closed system. One of them has to give. The stalkers, including figures like Jesse Ventura as Captain Freedom, function almost like physical extensions of that control. They're not just obstacles, they're embodiments of the system's attempt to enforce narrative boundaries through force. Each encounter with them is less about combat and more about containment, but containment only works if the subject agrees to the terms of the space they're in. Richards doesn't. And that's where the system starts to lose its balance, not in a sudden collapse, but in a gradual erosion that becomes harder and harder to ignore the closer you get to the end of the story. What the film ultimately shows, even in its most action-heavy moments, is that control over perception is just as important as control over physical space. And once those two start to diverge, once people begin to see the gap between what is happening and what they're being told is happening, the entire structure becomes unstable. That's the real trajectory of the story. Not just a man fighting for survival, but a system struggling to maintain the illusion that survival is even what's being decided in the first place. By the time the story reaches its final stretch in The Running Man, it stops feeling like a game that can be won in any traditional sense. The structure that once made the rules seem clear has already been stretched so far that what remains is closer to a collapsing framework than a functioning system. And that collapse doesn't happen in a single moment. It shows up in the way every layer starts interfering with the others. Inside the arena, Arnold Schwarzenegger as Ben Richards is no longer just navigating obstacles or surviving staged encounters. He's actively forcing the environment to respond in ways it wasn't designed to handle. And that's the key difference now. Earlier, the system dictated movement. Now, movement forces the system to react. That reversal is subtle in execution, but massive in implication. Because once a controlled environment starts reacting instead of directing, control becomes something you're constantly trying to recover rather than something you actually possess. And every attempt to recover it creates more instability. The stalkers, including figures like Jesse Ventura as Captain Freedom, begin to feel less like confident extensions of authority and more like increasingly pressured responses to unpredictability. Their presence is still dangerous, still theatrical, still engineered for spectacle, but the confidence behind their execution starts to thin out. You can sense it in the pacing of their encounters, in the way their dominance isn't as clean as it once appeared, in the way Richards no longer engages with them on their terms, forcing them into situations where their performance-driven strengths don't translate as effectively. And when performance stops guaranteeing control, something fundamental breaks. Because the entire system is built on the idea that spectacle equals authority. Back in the broadcast environment, that breakdown becomes even more visible. Killian, played by Richard Dawson, is still operating with the outward confidence of someone in charge, but the structure around him is no longer responding with the same obedience it once had. There are delays now, hesitations, decisions that feel slightly misaligned with the flow of events happening in real time. It's the kind of friction you only notice when a system that was previously seamless starts to misfire in small, almost imperceptible ways. But those small misfires accumulate quickly when live perception is the product. Because this isn't just about controlling events, it's about controlling interpretation as those events unfold. And Richards is disrupting both simultaneously. Inside the audience, the fracture that began earlier continues widening. The reactions are no longer uniform. Some viewers still cling to the narrative they've been fed, reacting exactly as intended. But others begin to show signs of cognitive dissonance, moments where what they're seeing doesn't fully align with what they've been told to believe, and once that gap becomes noticeable, it becomes self-reinforcing. People start looking for inconsistencies. And once you start looking, you almost always find them. That's where the system begins to lose its invisibility. Because control isn't just about shaping reality, it's about making the shaping process invisible. And visibility changes everything. Richards, intentionally or not, becomes the catalyst for that visibility. Not by delivering speeches or directly exposing the system in some clean, declarative way, but by simply behaving in ways that don't align with the expected narrative structure. Every deviation forces the system to adjust, and every adjustment creates evidence that adjustment is happening. That's the paradox at the center of the entire story. The system can respond to disruption, but in responding, it reveals itself. And revelation is something it was never designed to survive. Killian's attempts to maintain control begin to feel increasingly like containment rather than direction. The tone shifts from confident orchestration to reactive management. It's still structured, still deliberate, but the underlying certainty is gone. And when certainty disappears from a system built on perception, what remains is fragile. Meanwhile, Richards isn't operating with the illusion of control either, but he is operating with awareness. He understands now that survival isn't just physical, and it isn't just narrative. It's both at once. You don't just have to outlast threats. You have to outlast the version of yourself being constructed in real time by everyone watching, and that's an almost impossible position to maintain indefinitely. But the film doesn't frame it as a question of endurance alone. It frames it as escalation toward exposure, because every layer of resistance, every act of unpredictability, every failure of the system to fully contain him brings the underlying truth closer to visibility. Not resolution, not closure, visibility. And that's what the final movements of the story are really circling around. The moment where what's been hidden, reframed, and controlled can no longer be fully separated from what is actually happening. At that point, the system is no longer shaping the narrative with confidence. It's trying to keep up with a story that has already started telling itself in ways it can't fully rewrite.
And what makes that final stretch in The Running Man feel so unsettling if you really sit with it is that nothing actually stops in a clean cinematic way. The system doesn't power down. The arena doesn't suddenly go silent. The broadcast doesn't just cut to black and admit defeat. It keeps going. but it keeps going in a way that no longer holds together. And that's where everything around Arnold Schwarzenegger as Ben Richards reaches something that almost feels like negative resolution, where the story isn't resolving tension by answering it, but by letting the structure that created the tension continue without the ability to define it anymore. Because Richards is still there, still moving, still existing inside a framework that was built to control him, but that framework can't agree with itself about what he is. Every layer that tries to interpret him ends up exposing a contradiction somewhere else. He's a fugitive. He's a performer. He's a symbol. He's a glitch. And the system tries to hold all of those at once, which is exactly why it starts to come apart. The arena itself almost feels different now, not physically, but in the way it's being experienced. It used to function like a controlled environment where every movement had a clear narrative purpose. Now it feels like a space where multiple narratives are colliding in real time, none of them fully able to dominate the others. The stalkers, including someone like Jesse Ventura as Captain Freedom, still enter with that larger-than-life presence, still built like icons of controlled violence. But even their presence doesn't stabilize anything anymore. Instead, it adds to the noise, because now when they show up, the audience isn't just reacting, they're interpreting. Some still see them as heroes of the system. Some start to question the timing, the framing, the logic behind their appearances. And some are no longer sure what role they're supposed to play at all. That uncertainty doesn't explode. It spreads quietly. Inside the control room, Killian, Richard Dawson, feels like he's holding on to something that's already slipping away, even if he won't admit it out loud. His voice still carries authority, still pushes a version of events, still tries to keep everything aligned, but there's a subtle shift in the rhythm of how he speaks, in how quickly adjustments are made, in how often framing needs to be corrected. It's not smooth anymore, and smoothness was the entire illusion, because the power of that world never came from force alone. It came from how effortlessly everything felt connected. Once that effort becomes visible, once you can sense the seams being pulled and restitched in real time, the experience changes permanently. You're no longer watching something that is. You're watching something that's being made while you're watching it. And once that awareness kicks in, you can't unsee it. The audience inside the film reaches that exact threshold. You can almost feel the split widening, not in a dramatic uprising, not in some loud collective reaction, but in the quiet divergence of how people are processing what they're seeing. One person laughs, another hesitates, another starts to question, and those reactions don't sync back up. That's the moment where the system loses something it can't easily get back, because synchronized emotion is control. Unsynchronized emotion is freedom, but it's messy, unstable, unpredictable. And unpredictability is exactly what this entire structure was designed to eliminate. Richards doesn't need to destroy the system in a traditional sense, because by simply existing in a way that resists definition, he forces the system to reveal itself. Every time it tries to pin him down, it exposes the mechanics behind the illusion. Every time it adjusts the narrative around him, it shows that the narrative isn't fixed. And that's the real collapse. Not physical, not explosive, but perceptual. It's the moment where people start to realize that what they've been accepting as reality is actually something that can be edited, reshaped, and corrected on the fly. And once that idea takes hold, even partially, the entire foundation shifts, because belief isn't something you can force once doubt becomes visible. You can suppress it. You can distract from it. You can try to overwhelm it with spectacle. But you can't erase the moment someone notices the pattern. And by the time we reach the end of this progression, that pattern has already been seen. The system is still there. The game is still running. The broadcast is still active. But the certainty that once held it all together, the shared understanding of what any of it actually means, that's gone. And once that disappears, even for a fraction of the audience, the structure doesn't just weaken. It starts existing in a completely different way than it was ever designed to. At this point in The Running Man, the most important shift is that nothing the system does can return it to the kind of unified reality it used to project. The machinery is still running, the broadcast is still active, and the arena is still functioning, but the shared agreement that once made all of it feel like a single controlled experience has already fractured beyond repair. And that's where everything surrounding Arnold Schwarzenegger as Ben Richards reaches its final state of instability. Because Richards is still present inside the structure, still being framed, still being pursued, still being interpreted in real time. But none of those interpretations hold steady anymore. Every action he takes is now being split into multiple meanings depending on who is watching and how the system is trying to present it. The arena continues to operate. The stalkers, including figures like Jesse Ventura as Captain Freedom, still appear as designed symbols of dominance and control. They still carry the visual language of authority, still perform with intensity and spectacle, still represent the system's attempt to assert structure through force and performance. But the effect of that performance is no longer consistent. It no longer guarantees belief. And without guaranteed belief, spectacle loses its unifying power. Inside the broadcast control space, Killian, played by Richard Dawson, is still functioning as the voice of narrative authority, still guiding commentary, still attempting to preserve a coherent interpretation of events. But the nature of his authority has changed completely. He is no longer shaping reality in advance. He is constantly reacting to reality after it has already begun to deviate from the expected script. And that shift is the turning point of the entire system. Because authority that reacts instead of defines is already operating under loss of control. Every adjustment he makes is visible. Every correction draws attention to the fact that correction is necessary. And every visible correction weakens the illusion that anything is stable or predetermined. The audience inside the world reflects this breakdown in increasingly fragmented ways. The emotional synchronization that once made the broadcast feel like a unified experience is gone. Instead, multiple interpretations exist simultaneously, overlapping, but not aligning. Some viewers still accept the narrative framing without hesitation. Others notice contradictions between what they are seeing and how it is being explained. And others drift into a space where neither version feels fully reliable anymore. That fragmentation is irreversible in effect, because once perception splits into competing interpretations, it no longer naturally returns to unity. It expands instead. Through discussion, through observation, through repeated exposure to inconsistency. Richard sits at the center of this shift, not because he is delivering a clear countermessage, but because he continuously refuses to be stabilized into any single narrative role. Every attempt to define him produces contradiction. Every attempt to contain him produces visible system adjustments, and every adjustment exposes the machinery behind the broadcast. That exposure is what changes everything. Because once the audience becomes aware, consciously or not, that what they are watching is being actively shaped in real time, the illusion of transparency collapses, and what replaces it is awareness of construction. And construction is never unquestioned. At this stage, the system is still functioning mechanically, still producing content, still enforcing structure, but it is no longer functioning as a unified source of meaning. It has become a set of competing interpretive layers, trying to maintain coherence while simultaneously breaking it. And that is the final condition the story settles into. A system still operating, still broadcasting, still performing control, but no longer able to guarantee that what it presents will be understood as a single, stable version of reality. And in a world built entirely on shared perception, that loss of unity is already the point where everything begins to drift beyond full control. At this stage of The Running Man, the final tension isn't about escalation anymore. It's about what remains when escalation no longer produces a single, unified response from the system that created it in the first place. And that's where everything surrounding Arnold Schwarzenegger as Ben Richards reaches its last stable edge before complete interpretive breakdown. Because Richards is still inside the structure, still moving through the arena, still being tracked and broadcast and framed, but none of those actions are being resolved into one consistent meaning anymore. Instead, each layer of the system is producing its own version of what is happening, and those versions no longer fully align. The arena continues to function. The stalkers, including figures like Jesse Ventura as Captain Freedom, still enter with force, identity, and theatrical precision. They still represent the system's attempt to maintain dominance through spectacle and structured confrontation, but their symbolic power is no longer guaranteed. They still perform control, but the interpretation of that control is no longer unified. And that difference is everything, because when symbols stop producing shared meaning, they stop functioning as stable instruments of authority. Inside the broadcast control environment, Killian, played by Richard Dawson, is still operating as the narrative voice, still attempting to guide interpretation, still trying to maintain coherence across what the audience is seeing. But his role has shifted from shaping perception to managing fragmentation. And fragmentation is fundamentally harder to control than perception. Because perception can be directed. Fragmentation can only be contained temporarily. Every adjustment he makes now is reactive, and every reaction is visible enough to change how the audience understands the system itself. Instead of seeing a seamless broadcast, viewers begin to see a process of constant correction. And once correction becomes visible, authority begins to lose its invisibility. The audience inside the world reflects this shift in increasingly unstable patterns. The unified emotional response that once defined the broadcast experience is gone. Instead, reactions split into multiple interpretations happening at the same time, each one reinforcing the idea that there is no longer a single agreed reality being presented. Some viewers still engage with the spectacle exactly as intended. Others begin to question inconsistencies between what is shown and how it is explained. And others drift into uncertainty where neither framing feels fully reliable anymore. That uncertainty is not static, it spreads. Because once interpretation becomes individual rather than collective, meaning stops being centrally controlled, Richards remains at the center of this collapse, not because he provides a structured alternative, but because he cannot be stabilized into any single narrative identity. Every attempt to define him produces contradiction. Every attempt to contain him produces visible correction in the system's behavior. And every visible correction reveals the machinery behind the narrative. That exposure changes the relationship between audience and broadcast permanently, because what was once experienced as reality becomes recognized as construction. And construction is always subject to doubt. At this point, the system still operates. It still broadcasts. It still enforces structure. But it no longer functions as a unified source of meaning. Instead, it functions as competing layers of interpretation trying to maintain coherence while simultaneously breaking it. And that's the final condition the story settles into before its end. A system still active, still powerful in motion, but no longer capable of guaranteeing a single shared version of what reality actually is. And once that guarantee is gone, even temporarily, the structure has already moved beyond the point where it can fully return to its original form of control. At this stage of The Running Man, the story has essentially crossed into a space where the system is no longer failing in a single dramatic moment. It's continuing to function while losing the ability to define what its own function actually means. And that's where everything surrounding Arnold Schwarzenegger as Ben Richards reaches its final interpretive fracture. Because Richards is still inside the structure, still being broadcast, still being framed through the language of the game, But none of that framing is stable anymore. Each layer of the system is now producing its own version of reality, and those versions no longer converge into one agreed narrative. The arena continues to operate. The stalkers, including figures like Jesse Ventura as Captain Freedom, still appear with their designed identities intact. They still represent the system's attempt to enforce meaning through spectacle, force, and controlled confrontation. But their symbolic certainty has eroded. They are no longer universally interpreted as instruments of dominance. They are interpreted differently, depending on which layer of the broadcast the audience is absorbing. And that divergence is the key collapse point, because when symbols stop producing shared meaning, they stop functioning as control mechanisms. Inside the broadcast control space, Killian, played by Richard Dawson, is still speaking as if coherence can be maintained, still guiding interpretation, still attempting to preserve a unified narrative flow. But what he is actually doing now is managing fragmentation that can no longer be reversed, only temporarily contained. And that distinction changes the entire nature of authority, because authority that contains is still active, but authority that only contains instability is already operating in decline. Every adjustment he makes is now visible as adjustment. Every correction reveals that correction is necessary, and every attempt to smooth over contradictions only highlights the existence of those contradictions more clearly. That visibility is what breaks the illusion. The audience inside the world is no longer responding as a single emotional entity. Instead, reactions are split across multiple interpretations happening simultaneously. Some viewers continue to engage with the broadcast exactly as intended. Others notice inconsistencies between what is shown and what is explained. And others reach a point where neither version feels fully reliable anymore. And once reliability breaks, interpretation becomes personal rather than collective. That shift is irreversible in effect, because collective interpretation is what turns broadcast into shared reality. Without it, you only have competing perceptions of the same events. Richards exists at the center of that breakdown, not because he is actively delivering a structured opposition, but because he consistently refuses to stabilize into any fixed narrative identity. Every attempt to define him produces contradiction. Every attempt to contain him produces visible system correction, and every correction exposes the mechanism behind the narrative itself. That exposure is what the system cannot fully recover from. Because once people become aware, directly or indirectly, that what they are watching is being actively constructed and adjusted in real time, the illusion of transparency collapses, and what replaces it is recognition of process. And process is always open to doubt. At this point, the system is still functioning mechanically. It is still broadcasting events, still enforcing structure, still generating spectacle. But it is no longer functioning as a unified source of meaning. Instead, it has become a set of overlapping interpretive systems competing to define the same reality. And that is the final state the story settles into before any sense of resolution can even begin to form. A world still moving forward, still active, still intense, but no longer capable of ensuring that what it presents is understood as a single, stable truth. And once that stability is gone, even partially, the structure has already crossed into a condition where it cannot fully return to what it was before. At this point in The Running Man, the final stretch isn't really about adding anything new to the system. It's about watching what happens when every existing layer keeps operating, but none of them agree anymore on what reality is supposed to look like. And that's where everything surrounding Arnold Schwarzenegger as Ben Richards settles into its last unstable configuration. Because Richards is still inside the game, still being framed, still being broadcast as the central figure of the spectacle, but the meaning attached to him is no longer stable across the system. One version of the broadcast presents him as a threat, Another frames him as entertainment. Another subtly starts to drift into uncertainty, as if even the narration itself is struggling to keep pace with what he represents. The arena continues functioning. The stalkers, including figures like Jesse Ventura as Captain Freedom, still appear with their designed identities, still perform dominance, still act as if the structure they represent is absolute. But their role has shifted in perception. They are no longer universally read as symbols of control. They are interpreted through fractured perspectives depending on which layer of the broadcast an audience is experiencing. And that fracture is the real collapse. Because once interpretation stops being shared, control stops being centralized. Inside the broadcast control environment, Killian, played by Richard Dawson, is still operating as the voice of authority, still guiding commentary, still trying to maintain coherence across competing versions of what is happening. But his role has fully transitioned from shaping narrative to managing divergence. And divergence is fundamentally unstable. Because shaping implies direction. Managing implies damage control. And damage control is always a sign that something has already exceeded the structure's ability to contain it cleanly. Every adjustment made in real time now carries visible weight. The audience can sense when framing changes, when tone shifts, when interpretation is being corrected mid-flow. And that awareness itself becomes part of the viewing experience. Once viewers notice correction, they stop consuming content as seamless reality. They start consuming it as constructed reality. And constructed reality is always open to skepticism. That's where the audience inside the world becomes fully fragmented. There is no longer a shared emotional response guiding interpretation. Instead, multiple readings of the same events exist simultaneously, some aligned with the intended narrative, some partially questioning it, and some completely detached from its framing logic. And once that fragmentation begins, it cannot be fully reversed, because belief is no longer collective, it is distributed, and distributed belief cannot be centrally controlled in the same way. Richard sits at the center of this instability, not because he is consciously orchestrating it, but because he continuously resists being locked into any single stable identity within the system. Every attempt to define him produces contradiction. Every attempt to stabilize his narrative role produces visible correction in the broadcast structure. And every correction exposes the underlying machinery of control. That exposure is what fundamentally changes the system's behavior. Because invisible control maintains authority effortlessly, visible control must constantly justify itself, and justification is where doubt begins. At this point, the system still functions on a mechanical level. It still produces spectacle, still enforces structure, still broadcasts events, but it no longer produces unified meaning. Instead, it produces competing interpretations of the same reality, each one attempting to assert itself as the correct version. And that is the final condition the story leaves us in before resolution. A world still running, still active, still intense, but no longer able to guarantee that what it shows is experienced as a single, shared truth. And once that shared truth dissolves, even partially, the structure can no longer return to its original form of control without revealing what it has become.